Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. In this series, I speak to people who can help us think about human risk, which I define as the risk of people doing things they shouldn't or not doing things they should. In other words, people making mistakes. Now, one of my rules of human risk is that you can't eliminate it. That's because the human brain isn't designed for perfect rational decision making. And if it was, the world would be a duller place. Making mistakes is a normal part of human existence. Even the smartest and most experienced among us make frequent and predictable errors. My guest this time, strategy professor and former management consultant Olivier Sibony, has just published a book called You're About to Make a Terrible Mistake, in which he explores the processes we use to make decisions. In his book, Olivier draws on dozens of fascinating and engaging case studies to show how cognitive biases routinely lead all of us, including even the most famous business gurus, into 9 common decision-making traps. What he then proposes are ways that we can avoid these traps, not by reprogramming ourselves, but by using techniques and processes that leverage collective intelligence to help us make the best decisions possible. In our discussion, we explore what the common decision-making traps are and how we can overcome them. I loved Olivier's book when it was first published in French a few years ago, and the updated version in English is just as fabulous. In our discussion, I also take the opportunity to talk to him about his next book, Noise, which he's jointly authoring with Daniel Kahneman and Cass Sunstein. I know you're going to find this conversation fascinating, so please enjoy my discussion with Professor Olivier Sibony. Olivier, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Hello, Christian. Thanks for having me.
Listen, it's an absolute pleasure, and I can't wait to get on and talk about your book, which has been really fascinating from my perspective. I think really hits a human risk tone. But before we get there, I wonder if you could talk to my listeners a little bit about your background, because you've moved from business into academia, and so I think have quite an interesting insight that is highly relevant to the research that you do. So can we just explore a little bit about your background and how you came to where you are today?
Well, it's a simple story. It's slightly unusual, but not that unusual. I was a management consultant for 25 years. I was at McKinsey & Company, which I joined straight out of business school, and where I stayed until 5 years ago. I was a senior partner for many years, advising CEOs of large companies. And after about 25 years, I decided I wanted to embark on a second career as an academic. And the reason, and that's that's what leads us to our topic today. The reason was that throughout my career advising these amazing people I was serving, I was always surprised at how often, I mean, not every time, obviously, but how often they would make, frankly, obvious mistakes. We would advise people to do something, and they would say, yeah, well, thanks, we understand, we get this, it makes a lot of sense, and I'm going to do something else anyway. And that would happen actually more often than not. You don't see this when you're from the outside, because you only see the well-packaged explanation with all its wherefores and whys. But when you actually see the process of how the decision is made as it is being made, you actually see that it's a lot messier than it's often assumed to be. And so my intellectual interest has always been in trying to understand that better. And that's what led me to what I study today.
Fantastic. And your sort of area of specialism in terms of academia, can you just talk about what you're sort of focused on there?
So I'm a professor at HEC in Paris, in the strategy department, but my area of interest and research is a subfield of strategy called behavioral strategy. And to make a long story short, behavioral strategy is to strategy what behavioral economics is to economics, what behavioral marketing is to marketing, and what, for many of your listeners, I suspect, behavioral finance is to finance. In other words, it's an attempt to apply to the field of strategic decision-making the understanding of how actual humans make actual decisions and formulate actual judgments that we have thanks to 5 decades of behavioral science.
And that's led you to publish a book that you published in French, which I had the pleasure of reading then, and I've been desperately waiting for the English version so I can bring it to my audience. So you've published a book that basically looks at exactly this point, which is around the strategic errors that people have made. And what inspired you to write it as a book?
Well, there's two sources of inspiration. The first is the one I was describing earlier, which is that when you actually look at how decisions are made in companies, they are made in ways that essentially guarantee that there will be big mistakes. And that was the observation that I had empirically as someone who has seen how the decisions are made. The interesting thing there, to my mind, was that it's a bit like the story of the sausage. Even if you like sausage, you don't want to see how the sausage is made, right? And even if you like the decision, even if the outcome is good, you actually don't want to see how the decision has been made. It's not great. So if we could improve the way the decision is made, we would, on average, be likelier to get a good outcome. That was my thesis, and that's what I've been exploring in this book. That's the empirical angle. The theoretical angle, which of course got me excited when I became an academic, was actually not such a theoretical question. It's a fairly practical question too. Lots of strategic decisions go wrong more often than not. They go wrong more often than right, basically. The most obvious example is big acquisitions. If you study big acquisitions, and lots of professors of finance have done that, and there's been meta-analysis of the studies of those professors, by and large, the general rule is that the acquirer will overpay. The acquirer will overestimate the synergies. There might be a bidding war. In the end, the acquirer will pay too much for something that is worth whatever it's worth. And if someone creates value in the deal, it will be the shareholders of the seller. Now, we know that. We've known it for a long time. It's been written about in dozens of academic papers. Those papers have been picked up by the likes of Harvard Business Review and Sloan Management Review and the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal. You cannot be an executive today and not know about that. So common sense would suggest that you learn, that you don't make the same mistakes again that others have made before you repeatedly on something that is as clear and identifiable. And yet, this doesn't seem to change. This is one example. There are many examples like this of recurrent strategic mistakes. Now, the problem, the theoretical problem this poses is that something's wrong here, right? I mean, if smart people aren't learning, what could be the reason? Well, some people say it's their incentives that are wrong, but actually that's not true. The incentives of executives are usually, by now, pretty well aligned with the incentives of their shareholders. That's what stock options are for all the bad things you can say about them, stock options and incentive schemes and so on. So usually, you and very often actually, you find executives making decisions that aren't good for them. It's not that they're doing something that is good for them and bad for their shareholders. That's easy to explain. It's that they do stuff that is bad for them, and they should know it's bad for them because we have a lot of history showing that it's bad for them. So the theoretical question here is, why do people not learn? And the conjunction of these two angles brought me to the book you're talking about here, which is You're About to Make a Terrible Mistake in English, which talks about what those types of recurring errors are and how they can be explained, understood through the prism of the cognitive biases of the decision makers and the organizational processes of the companies or the organizations more broadly in which they are being made.
And, when you put it in those terms, it's absolutely astonishing because what you're seeing is people, and as you say, it's not a function of intelligence, but people who are in organizations making mistakes that we can all recognize from our own day-to-day existence. We've all overpaid for things. We've all done stupid things in our personal lives. So this is a human dynamic that gets carried through into the corporate environment. And in many respects, from what I'm reading in your piece and sort of thinking this subject through, it's almost exacerbated by the corporate structure.
It is. I tell one story I tell in the book is the story. I don't give names, obviously, but the story of my first engagement as a strategy consultant when I was literally a 20 or 21-year-old trainee, and I could see that the CEO, who was a universally admired captain of industry was about to make a terrible mistake. I mean, the logic of what he was describing to us, I tell the story in the book, didn't make any sense. It was obvious to me, and I knew nothing. It was obvious to all my colleagues who knew something. And somehow, this man decided that he was going to ignore all common sense and to make a huge gamble. And in this particular case, he turned out to be lucky. Good for him, right? But I've also seen lots of cases later where they turned out not to be so lucky. And arguably, it is irrational to gamble the entire company and your career and your own fortune and so on something that is essentially a roll of the dice, which is what this man was doing. Now, that's an extreme example, but there's been many examples like that. The striking thing, as you pointed out, is it doesn't take any great wisdom to see that a mistake is in the process of being made there. If you're just an observer and an impartial spectator, as Adam Smith would say, you can actually see that the mistake is in the process of being made, and therefore, if the decision-making process and the organization are set up appropriately, you might be able to do something about it. That's the remedial part of the book, the part that should be of interest to business people.
And the astonishing thing here is, I mean, you talk about, you use the Dan Ariely phrase, predictably irrational, in how you sort of introduce this piece, but is the recurring nature of this. So this isn't sort of people going off and doing crazy, unique things. History seems to repeat itself. And we have lots of examples of, you could sort of say, well, didn't you look at that? And either that's something around even within the own organization, people don't seem to be able to learn from history, but certainly from the sort of history of business, there are plenty of examples where you would say, if you just read that textbook or just looked at that example, you might have had a clue this wasn't a good idea.
Yeah, I jokingly call this the reverse Anna Karenina principle of strategic decision making. The first sentence of Anna Karenina is something like, I'm not sure of the exact English words, but something like all happy families are alike, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And in fact, for strategic decisions, it's the opposite. All happy strategic decisions or great strategies are great in their own way. They're unique. That's why they are successful strategies. On the other hand, all or most unhappy strategic decisions are alike. When I was giving the example of overpaying for acquisitions, the next person who does this will make a mistake that is very similar to the mistakes that have been made by others before. To pick another example, a pattern called the escalation of commitment into a losing venture. Look at how, for instance, last year, I think, or maybe the year before, General Motors sold its European division, Opel Vauxhall, to PSA of France. That particular division had been losing money for 16 straight years. Now, you would think that when a business has been losing money for 2-3 years, you say, well, okay, no, we're going to turn it around. 4-5 years, you say, yeah, we're having a problem. Let's try something different and radical. 6-7 years, you say, well, we've really had bad management. Let's bring someone else in. But 16 years. Now, here's the interesting part. That is far from being the worst example, even within GM. GM had a division called Saturn, which lost money for 30 straight years before they eventually decided to sell it off, which, of course, by then, they couldn't. There was nobody willing to buy a business that had been losing money for 30 straight years. GM probably plowed tens of billions into that business before it decided to shut it down. The pattern here is this pattern of throwing good money after bad and refusing to take your losses by selling off or shutting down something that is losing money is a form of escalation of commitment. It is very, very frequent. When you look at the rate at which big corporations are divesting businesses, it is far less than the normal turnover of a portfolio would suggest, simply because it is very hard for them to face the fact that they've made a mistake and that they should write it off and cut their losses and move on to do something else. So that's another example. There are many examples like that of recurring mistakes, and those are the ones I explore in the book.
And one of the things I thought was interesting was you also look at sort of the, why does this happen? So one of the classic stories that always gets told, which you reference, is the sort of Blockbuster Netflix thing. So with the benefit of hindsight, we look and criticize Blockbuster management. Oh, idiots for not buying Netflix when you could have done. And as you rightly point out, there were probably tons of companies that approached them and tons of such discussions. And we ignore those and focus on the one big failure that arguably, and we make huge presumptions about what would have happened in a post-acquisition world. But if they bought Netflix, they'd have been okay. And there is something interesting. So, that there is often a rationale to the madness. It doesn't necessarily justify it with hindsight, but there is an interesting piece here. It's a very human thing here, which is there is some logic to what we do.
Oh, we always make up some logic. There is always a way to explain. There is always a way to rationalize what we do and to explain how and why we're making the decision we're making. Take the story of Blockbuster and Netflix. And as you point out, there are two sides to this story. The way the story is being told now is, Blockbuster was so stupid not to buy Netflix when they came hat in hand to see Netflix after the first .com bubble burst. And Netflix was desperate to find some money. Basically, they offered to sell 50% of Netflix to Blockbuster for what I think was about 50 million. I don't remember the exact number. But basically for a paltry sum of money compared to what Netflix is worth today. The first way this story is usually being told is look at how stupid and arrogant the people at Netflix were. They, as Netflix tells the story, they literally laughed them out of the room. They said, we don't need you. We are strong. We are big. We can decide to create a business of DVD by mail tomorrow if we want to, which is what Netflix was at the time. We are not interested in doing that because we don't think it's a very exciting business. But if we were excited about this, we would be able to do it on our own. Thanks for coming. Have a nice trip back. That's basically the explanation they had, and that's the way the story is told today. Now, obviously, as you point out, they probably got a lot of offers from a lot of people at that time. And when we say, they should have bought Netflix, we are ourselves victims of a cognitive bias called the survivor bias, which is that we just look at the one that survived. We don't say they should have bought XYZ Incorporated, which also made them an offer, because we've never heard about XYZ Incorporated, which went bankrupt a month later. Now, if they had bought XYZ Incorporated, we would say, well, they were stupid to buy XYZ and not Netflix. But, it's very easy to say. So that's a mistake we all make. Now, what we can reasonably say Blockbuster got wrong at the time is not that they didn't buy Netflix. It's that they didn't do much about the digital transition that their industry was undergoing. They could have seen that the pattern of being disrupted by a new technology, which is something that has happened in the press, in telecom, in records, in the records with MP3, in industry after industry after industry, that was coming to them. What did they do about that? Obviously not enough. They did do some things, but obviously not enough for all the traditional reasons why incumbents do not respond sufficiently strongly to disruption. This is another example of those recurring mistakes that we've been warned about, we know about. We've heard the story of how the airlines were laughing at Ryanair and EasyJet and saying, these people are not like us, they will never target our consumers. We've heard the story of how the newspapers were laughing at the internet and saying, this is poor quality content, our readers will never be interested in reading on a screen. We've heard all those stories, we laugh at them, we scoff at them, and yet when it happens to us, we say, no, but this is different. Right? We are different. Obviously, we understand disruption, but we are different. That's what, in its way, I think happened to Blockbuster and happens to lots of companies. You can see them today.
And so we identify these repeat patterns, the decision traps, as you call them. And then you move on to sort of explore, some of the dynamics that are there around how we solve that. And one of them you talk about is the fact that we can't override our own biases. because they're naturally pre-programmed. And so one of the ways that we do this, and this is, I think this is fascinating from an evolutionary perspective, is we sort of implicitly recognize that, which is why we hang around in tribes. Let's bring wisdom of the crowds. Let's bring a larger number of people. And we sort of eliminate the individual biases by getting together, and one person's strengths make up another person's weaknesses and vice versa.
So that's the basic idea. But before we get there, we need to deal with a myth here. The myth is that the people who make those mistakes are bad people. The CEO of Blockbuster, and that's the way the story is usually told about Blockbuster or any of those failures that I talk about. Oh, the CEO of Blockbuster, he was arrogant and dumb, right? He was full of himself. He was a victim of hubris. We tell the story in moralistic terms, right? Or in terms of incompetence. We say, oh, he didn't see the threat. He was a bad CEO. And the problem here is that if we're talking about recurring mistakes, about mistakes that happen over and over again, and the only explanation we can come up with is that the people who are making those mistakes are bad people, basically it means that we have a recurring tendency to pick bad people to head up the largest and most important companies in the world. Now that may be the case, but it does sound a little bit implausible, doesn't it? Right? I mean, why would it be that we systematically pick the people who have, who not only have those deep moral flaws, like being arrogant and hubristic and so on, but also have somehow managed to conceal them until they became CEOs and only reveal those flaws once they become CEOs. Well, basically our standard explanation for why people make mistakes is something like, those the God will destroy, they first make mad, or something like that. Right. It's not very scientific, is it? So the problem here is that we try to pin the decision down on the flaws of a single person. When in fact, if you step back for a minute and you say, this problem is happening to lots of people in lots of companies at lots of different times. They are all making the same mistakes. Well, if you see 1,000 identical mistakes, you probably have one single explanation rather than 1,000 bad people. And the explanation, I argue, is that the combination of how we as human beings, not just CEOs, but how we human beings make decisions with our limitations and cognitive biases, and the way those decisions are set up in organizations, creates those recurring problems or enables those recurring problems. The reason this, and it sounds like, it doesn't sound like there's a big difference between saying what I just said and saying, these people have flaws and they make mistakes. But actually there is a big difference. The difference between a cognitive bias and a flaw is that you and I and everybody else has the same cognitive biases. Not necessarily to the same degree, but we have them because we're humans. We are, for instance, overconfident because we're humans. We tend to be optimistic because we're humans. We tend to remain anchored on a number that has been quoted to us, even if we try to disregard it, because we're human. All those things are not because we are good or bad, because we are arrogant or hubristic, or because we are somehow failing in some moral way. They are there because we're human beings. Once you recognize that, and you stop saying that those mistakes are the product of a few bad apples, of a few bad people, you can actually start to put in place a system, a way of making decisions, a process for the organization to try to tame those biases that is going to be more effective. And the reason, as you say, it has to be the tribe bending together or some sort of collective wisdom or collective intelligence is because it's awfully difficult for me to see my own biases, for you to see your own. But as in the example of young Olivier, 20 years old, looking at the CEO and seeing, this guy is about to make a terrible mistake, it's very easy for someone else, even someone who is not that smart and not that educated, to see that I'm making a mistake. And if I will just find a way to be forced to listen to that person as he or she tells me, Olivier, you're about to make a mistake, I'm slightly less likely to make that mistake. That's the basic idea. You need collegiality, you need collaboration, you need more than one person making the decision, that's kind of obvious, but it's actually difficult to make happen. And once you've heard several viewpoints, because you have had some collegiality, you need some sort of process to make the decision emerge from this, because otherwise you will have a long debate and no decision. So collegiality and process, collaboration and method, those are the two ingredients that you must have to make better strategic decisions that overcome the biases of the individual decision makers.
And there's something interesting around, if we look at companies and individuals. So if I talk about Apple, people naturally think about Steve Jobs or Tim Cook, or Facebook, you're Zuckerberg. There is this sort of cult of personality. And I think it seems to me it's become more prevalent in recent years with founders and kind of dominant chief exec. But there seems to be something in the corporate structure that revolves around these sort of demigods who are revered and respected, that goes against what you've just said. So the sort of the trope of the dominant CEO is quite well known, and there's plenty of examples. I, of course, recognizing that there's lots of examples I haven't seen, but the ones I have, the narrative there is always around the individual associated with the organization, and those dynamics you talk about don't seem to be naturally built in.
No, well, first of all, the cult of personality is actually not as widespread as we would think by looking at the media, because the media needs pictures on the cover. So if you read Fortune or Bloomberg and you just look at the people on the cover, you will think that business is a cult, and that every little cult has its own guru. And yes, there are companies in which that is the case, and yes, there are imperial CEOs who believe that they are the salt of the earth and that they don't need to take advice from anybody else. But it's an interesting split. When both back when I was a consultant and since I've become an academic, I've had lots of conversations with CEOs and senior executives about basically what I'm talking about here. And when you're in a one-on-one conversation and it's with people you know well, they will actually tell you what they think about it. They won't give you the polite, oh yes, it's very interesting, I do this all the time, right? Which of course they will say in public, because who wants to say, I don't care what people think, I'm smarter. So in fact, when you're one-on-one, some people do say that. That's interesting. I have CEO friends who told me, Olivier, your book is really interesting and I really like you, but I'm not going to do any of this because the reason I'm the CEO is because I'm smarter than everybody else in the corporation. And basically, I'm here to make the decisions. I'm here to call the shots. If it goes wrong, I will be blamed anyway. I don't really trust anyone to be smarter than me. So it's all very interesting what you say. It might actually make sense to apply to my subordinates. I would want their decisions to be made according to some good process and to have some form of quality control. But my decisions should be exempt from that. Now, there are some people who will say that to me. They are not a majority. They are, I regret to say, there are a slightly higher percentage in France than in other countries, but they are not a majority. I would say they're about a third of the CEOs. About 2/3 say some version of, yes, I totally get this. I would love to have a better decision-making process. I would love to get my people to contribute more. I would love to get them to speak up. The problem I have is that they don't. They suck up to me. They tell me what they think I want to hear. It's awfully hard to get them to speak up. And then when they do speak up, and sometimes they do, it's very often not because they are trying to do the right thing, but because they are playing politics. They are trying to push their own agenda, the agenda of their function, of their division, of their people. They are trying to defend their past decisions and so on. So, you tell me that I should listen to them, Olivier, but in fact, I do listen to them. And when I listen to them, I am often disappointed by what I hear. How do I overcome those problems? How do I get the people who don't speak up because they don't want to displease me to actually speak up? And how do I get the people who speak up but for the wrong reasons to shut up or speak up for the right reasons? Those are the problems that you need to tackle, and they are organizational problems. They are management problems. I would actually argue that they are the most important problem that any CEO should deal with. I call it the decision architecture of the organization. Being a good decision architect, being the architect of decision-making processes that are going to produce the right decisions in your organization, is probably the most important thing that you can do as a CEO. If you believe that you are not going to call the shots yourself, that you are going to need to rely on the collective intelligence of many of the people around you to contribute to those decisions, which, with the exception of the friend I was quoting earlier, most CEOs would agree with. If you believe that, then you need some sort of process to make that happen. And if you can design that process, you will have done your organization a service that will, not only make it more successful under your leadership, but also endure and be a legacy that you leave to your organization as a place where decisions are made the right way.
But it's sort of challenging though, right? Because if you have risen to the top of an organization that operates on a certain basis, you have been playing that very game that you've just described. And so potentially your ability to change that game once you've sort of risen to the top of it is presumably fairly limited, because that's the game that you have been playing. So it's very difficult, I'm assuming, to pivot into a world where you say the rules of the game that got me here are, now need to be destroyed or changed at least into a new form. That's a tough thing to do.
And in fact, I'm not suggesting that you pitch it exactly that way. Because if you say, we are going to completely change the way we make decisions around here, it's going to be a big democracy or holacracy or, free company or whatever you call this, that's a completely different ballgame, and most likely no one is going to believe you, especially if you've been playing the game to get to the top of the organization in a traditional organization. So what I'm suggesting is you don't actually position it that way, but you change the very practical, nitty-gritty ways in which decisions are made from the bottom up. It starts with things as simple as how meetings are run. So take a very simple example. You have an executive committee meeting, you're reviewing a particular decision, you've heard someone pitch the proposal, and you say, well, it's a very interesting proposal. I'd like to hear what everybody thinks about this. Let's go around the room and hear everyone's opinion. That's how most people run a meeting, right? It could be an executive committee, or it could be the management of a division, or it could be a Monday morning meeting in the customer service department. It's basically the way meetings are run. Now, take this and just make one little change. Say, I would like everyone to write down what they think of the proposal. Let's take a minute in silence for everyone to write down what they think. And then I would like everyone to read what they wrote. Right. Now, I haven't made a big pronouncement here about how we're going to change the way decisions are made in this company, but I've used a small little trick that makes it less likely that we're going to fall into the groupthink trap. You know what groupthink is? It's the tendency that people will have in the first setting I described to align on what people before them have said, not just because they are political animals, which they are, but also because they genuinely believe that if three people have said, it's a very interesting proposal, even though they initially thought it was not such a great proposal, they're thinking, well, my three colleagues plus the CEO, they're all smart people. If they all think it's a good proposal, maybe I should revise my opinion. It's a very rational thing to do, right? So that results in this problem called groupthink, where just because of the happenstance of the first people who spoke, or because of the careful choice of the first people who spoke by the CEO who is trying to steer the discussion in a particular way, but that's another issue, because of the order in which people spoke, at any rate, you will get to an outcome that may not be the right outcome because you will not have heard the minority opinions, the dissenting opinions. Now, by just making this one small change, you have increased the chances that you will hear the dissenters, that you will give a voice to the minority opinions, and that therefore you will collectively make a better informed, more enlightened decision. This isn't a big revolution, it is one small change. This is one example of what I call a countermeasure against biases. It's a small decision technique that can overcome some of the biases. I give about 40 examples in my book of little things like this. Not all of them are as little as this one, are as easy to implement as this one, but many are. And in aggregate, when you implement 1 and 2 and 3 and maybe 4 and 5 and later more of those, you start to build a decision-making architecture that has more collegiality and that has a better decision-making process. It's not a big revolution where you announce, from now on, I'm not the CEO anymore, and we're all going to make decisions by vote. It's not at all what I'm talking about. I'm talking about having a better process to inform the decisions in the existing power structure.
And the bit I thought was really interesting, and I love the practicality of this stuff. It's one of the reasons I thought the book was great, is it posits the problem, explores it, and then says, here's what we can do about it, which is always a much healthier read than people that stop at just identifying the problem or come up with sort of theoretical solutions that aren't practical. This is sort of a series of practice, you say practical steps. What I thought was really fascinating was, as I was reading some of those, and the example you've just given is a good one, you can find lots of precedents in history for similar thinking, where we have recognized the fallibility of human decision making, where we've got, and there's plenty of stories, whether you go from the Bible or you go of sort of, techniques that we use to deal with the challenges of overly autocratic decision making, or, King Canute's a really good example of sort of people sucking up and I'm going to call this stuff out. And, the small boy represents a really good example of sort of the emperor's new clothes as well. There's lots of examples there, I think, of sort of history teaching this stuff. And what you've done is sort of identified and said, actually, this is relevant to modern. And it's strange that we've kind of lost some of those things, but it's lovely that you've refound practical, simple things that history tells us work to be able to deploy in the modern world. Yeah,
each of those 40 things that I'm talking about is actually done somewhere. I mean, it has been done somewhere in history, sometimes thousands of years ago, as you point out. But most of them are being used by some company or other, or some organization of other right now with some success. Now, what I don't do, with a few exceptions because they are well known, is tell you, this is what Apple does, and this is what GE does, and this is what Amazon does, because one of the traps that we fall into, and one of the decision traps that I describe, is precisely this tendency to copy and paste a practice from a successful organization just because it's successful. I would like to encourage the readers to pick up some of those practices, or to invent their own, but to pick up some of those practices because they make sense for them, because there is a good argument from first principles to be made for those practices, not because so-and-so is doing it and so-and-so is successful, therefore it must be good. There's a flaw, obviously, in the logic of that reasoning. And very often when you actually start digging, you realize that so-and-so isn't actually doing that, or isn't actually doing it anymore. A famous example was... there's lots of famous examples, never mind that. But, and even when so-and-so is actually doing that, it may be doing that for reasons that are completely inapplicable to your own situation. So I'm not suggesting that we copy and paste things that have been done by successful, at successful points in history because they have been done in history. I'm suggesting them because they are logically antidotes to some of the problems that I've highlighted, which have to do with cognitive biases. Once we've identified the problems, once we know what biases are tripping us, we can actually look for ways to make decisions that are going to make it less likely that they actually trip us. And that's the way to think about it.
I loved when you were talking about copying other people's ideas. It always makes me smile when I look at the Theranos photos when she is dressed like Steve Jobs.
Oh yes, the black turtleneck.
Right.
Yeah. I'm young, ambitious, and I have a black turtleneck. Therefore, I'm Steve Jobs. Now, the interesting story about this one, this is a very interesting story, which I don't talk about in the book, simply because it was written earlier. But there's a lot of things in that story that show you how some amazingly smart people, Howard Schultz, the man who won the Cold War, was to the very end was a believer in Theranos. It's amazing, right? I mean, how a persuasive person with a good story can actually convince some extremely smart and not at all naive people. Now, there's an interesting twist to the Theranos story, which is that if you look at the people who were actually investing in Theranos, look at who was not investing in Theranos. There were no big biotech specialized venture capital firms. There were no people with technical expertise of diagnostics or of medical technology in general. They were basically outsiders who were taken with the story. The people who did their homework, who actually went beyond the story, who didn't just look at the turtleneck and the bright eyes of Elizabeth Holmes and the devouring ambition, which are all great things. Those who actually knew something about the technique, the physics of miniaturizing the diagnostics into a little box like this, were very skeptical and didn't invest. That should have been a warning sign. Hindsight is very easy. We can always say, it was obvious they would fail. It wasn't obvious to me, certainly, but it's interesting that it was, if not obvious, at least very likely that they would fail for all the serious investors who knew what they were talking about. That is, by the way, an example of a good decision-making process that you can have. Ask the people who know. If the experts aren't investing in something, it's usually a warning sign. I've got other stories in my book that are on the same pattern. There's a great story of the belief in, which seems completely preposterous, the belief that you can detect the presence of oil underground from the sky by flying over ground with an airplane. Now, this sounds absurd on the face of it, but there were not one, but at least two instances in which extremely smart people were willing to bet about $500 million in today's money on that belief. One was 40 years ago in France, and one was 10 years ago in California. It's basically the same story. In both cases, it's people who are extremely smart. One of them is the president of France. Another one is a bunch of investors at Goldman Sachs and Kleiner Perkins and so on. The only thing that they have in common is that the people who actually know what they're talking about are not part of the story. So, having experts look at something, it seems obvious when you say it like this, right? Having experts look at something can actually help.
But there's an interesting thing societally now, and we can see it in certain aspects of politics. I sit in the UK where there was a famous quote around the Brexit situation of, we've had enough of experts.
Oh, yes.
We have, the sort of democratization of news and expertise, and it's very easy to get have an opinion and express it. So there's something interesting nowadays about that sort of the heuristic that would say we can go to experts, when I can find lots of either self-proclaimed experts or people that I can decide are experts just by dint of the fact that I've read something from them somewhere. That seems to be a really unhelpful counterweight to this dynamic you're talking about.
Well, we've been through a perfect example of this with the COVID-19 crisis, where suddenly everybody is an expert in everything about COVID. There was, you heard about the debates on chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine as a potential remedy for COVID. There has been lots of studies and so on. Before we even saw the studies and the one in the Lancet, which wasn't right, and the ones that actually come to the same conclusion, which are probably right. And, I don't have a strong point of view on whether hydroxychloroquine is effective against COVID-19 or not. It seems to me that the bulk of the evidence suggests it isn't, but that's not the point. The point is everybody seems to have an opinion. There was an opinion poll in France back in March or early April, so before we even had any of those studies, which no one reads anyway, asking common folk, do you think it works against COVID? And the answer was about 60% think it does and 20% think it doesn't. The point is 80% have an opinion. Right? I didn't have an opinion then. I'm not even sure I have an opinion now. But somehow everybody feels entitled to having an opinion. Now, that is the sort, we're talking about politics and culture here. That is not the sort of decision-making that should happen inside a well-run organization. A good decision architecture should make sure that inside an organization that isn't subject to the vote of the people, you might try to have a decision-making that is more grounded in logic and facts and less grounded in emotions and opinion. At least you would hope so.
That's fascinating because I mean, it sort of occurs to me that, coronavirus is exposing many inefficient processes. And we're there's a sort of interesting dynamic here that says we're starting to see business decisions that don't look so strategies that were predicated on certain presumptions that didn't contemplate this sort of world. Just-in-time supply chains being a really interesting example of something that looks great in theory, not so good in practice. So there's an interesting piece here that sort of, you talk about we should introduce more logic and challenge. Here's a really good case study, as you say, for stress testing previous decision-making and strategies. And had we deployed some of these techniques, you might not see so many businesses up against it in a way that they are.
Maybe not, but let me try to point out something important about this. You take the example of supply chains. Is it fair to say that a business that was dependent on China for its supply chain had made a mistake because it should have anticipated the coronavirus? I don't think it's fair. Is it fair to say that if you hadn't stocked up on masks and you didn't have 1 million masks in your backyard in case there was a coronavirus, you were incompetent and should be shot? I don't think it's fair. Now, in hindsight, this is exactly what people are saying, right? I mean, I'm sure it's the same in the UK. In France, we have parliamentary commissions that are grilling every minister and junior cabinet member about, why hadn't you planned for that? And why weren't you prepared for this? And why hadn't you anticipated that? Now, some of this is justified, but it's very hard to put ourselves back in the state of ignorance and uncertainty in which we were before we knew what we know now. Now, apply this to a business. If you look back and you say, oh my God, we shouldn't have had a supply chain that was so just in time because we should have anticipated complete disruption on a scale that the world has never known before. Well, that's a bit like saying that you should design your bridges to withstand a level of water that is going to happen once in a century. Maybe you should, but it's a trade-off. That has a cost. Now, for many, many, many years, having a supply chain that was international and flexible and so on was actually a pretty good thing. I don't think it makes sense to say just because you have been a victim of this particular crisis, you had made the wrong decisions before. It's true in this crisis. It is true in general. And this is harder to explain, but just because you have had a bad outcome, just because you have had a failure, does not mean that you had made a mistake. It may be the case that the decision you made at the time you made it was the best possible decision, and it entailed some risk, because every business decision must entail some risk. If it doesn't, failure is not a possibility, it's certain, it's guaranteed. If you don't take any risks, you will fail in business, that's for sure. If you take risks, you will have failures. Now, the hard thing is to look at those failures, to look back and to say, what can we learn from them? And to be prepared to say something that is unthinkable in most organizations, which is, we didn't do anything wrong. We made the right decision. It didn't turn out right. But if we had to do it again, we would do it again. There is one person who said this spectacularly recently. It's Jeff Bezos. You may have heard about the story of the Fire phone. Jeff Bezos tried, and it was a very personal project of Jeff's. He tried to launch a phone to compete with Apple and Android, a smartphone, Amazon branded, with some features that it turned out people weren't very interested in. It was a spectacular failure. After a few weeks, they had to give it away for 99 cents with a year of Amazon Prime thrown in just to get rid of the inventory. And they probably lost a few $100 million in this venture. And so Jeff gets asked by, I think, the Washington Post, so what happened there? It's a big failure, isn't it? And his answer is, you know what? We have much bigger failures in the works. We're going to have much bigger failures, and some of those are going to make the Fire phone look like a tiny little blip. And that means if you don't like those failures, don't invest in Amazon because we're going to keep taking big risks. Now, what is Jeff saying? Obviously, he's not saying that he is planning to fail. What he's saying is that if you have a company the size of Amazon and you want to grow, you need to take risks. If it's the size of Amazon, they need to be big risks. Some of them will be big successes, like the Echo and Alexa and so on, and some of them will be big failures, like the Fire Phone. But that's a fact of life when you take risks. You need to be able to look back at those decisions and to say, when did we make a mistake and what can we learn from it? When did we not make a mistake? And the lesson should not be that we should stop taking risks and become more risk averse, because that would spell disaster. So when we look back at a crisis or at an outcome that we don't like in general, the very hard thing is to resist the temptation to draw lessons in hindsight based on what we now know, because everything is very easy in hindsight. The hard thing to do is to evaluate the decisions at the time you are making them with the information you have when you're making them, and to decide whether the level of risk you're taking in those decisions is the level of risk you want to take. That's the way to evaluate decisions.
Right. And it's that question, of course, of do you know what risks you're taking? And I think, it always strikes me the very maligned Donald Rumsfeld quote around unknown unknowns. Which sort of at the time was ridiculed, but I think actually there is something hugely significant to it. And it's this point, it seems to me that many organizations are taking risks they don't fully understand. And therefore that trade-off isn't as obvious at the point of the decision making. And so you're sort of, as you say, every decision has a risk, but you're not necessarily thinking about the things that you don't know and some of those challenges. And that doesn't enter the process because the process is designed with a sort of positive skew in it. Someone spent some time looking at this, so they will present at a committee and we will all nod applaudingly because it sounds very sensible.
Yeah, what you just pointed out, the way risks are discussed in most organizations is the real issue. The right way to take risks is to take a risk in full knowledge that you are taking the risk. Now, that's what finance people usually are pretty good at. They say, I'm going to take this risk. I know what the downside is. I know what the upside is, or at least I hope I know what the downside and the upsides are. It's part of a portfolio of risks, and therefore some of these things are going to pay off and some aren't, and on average, I'm hoping to beat the market. That's a logic that for finance people makes sense. For gamblers, it makes sense as well. If you're not a gambler but a poker player, for instance, you know that your aim is not to win every hand, it's to win more than your fair share of hands and to win the larger ones, because you are trying to beat the odds every time by applying skill to something in which there remains a component of luck. A large component of luck in the case of poker, a large component of luck in the case of business too, by the way. And we try to neglect that. Now, look at how risks are actually discussed when people are talking about making an acquisition or making an investment and so on. What you want to hear when you're the decision maker and what the recommenders will tell you is, we've got it under control. There is no risk. Usually, at the end of a plan that is being presented, there will be a page that says risks, and the right-hand side of that page will be mitigating actions. Right? We have identified all the risks. There are no unknown unknowns. We know all the unknowns. And by the way, not only do we know the unknowns, we've done everything we can to prevent the unknowns from making the plan turn out bad. So in fact, there is no risk. You can invest in this with your eyes closed, right? What we do in those discussions is we deny the existence of risk. The way companies end up taking risks, interestingly, is not, and again, I leave financials aside because they are more mature about this, but the way most industrial companies end up taking risks is because they somehow manage to delude themselves into believing that they are not taking any risk. They somehow manage to have a decision process that leads them to believe that the risk has been eliminated. Risk, in the mind, the very word risk, in the mind of an operational manager, is something to be eliminated. It's not something to be welcomed, to be embraced, to be managed, to be tamed. It's something to be crossed off. If there are risks in your plan, I won't invest in your plan. That's interesting, isn't it? As long as we don't have the maturity to recognize that any business decision entails risks and that we should have an adult discussion about those risks, then we are not making the right decisions. By the way, once we do that, we become able to look back on those decisions a year or 2 years or 3 years later and to say, Christian, you recommended that decision. It was a failure. You are promoted. It was the right decision to make at the time. We all decided together to take that risk. The reason it failed had nothing to do with you. Congratulations. That doesn't happen very often, does it? But if it does, then the likes of Christian in the next generation will know that the right thing to do is A, to be willing to take risks, without which the entire company goes to hell, and B, to be open and transparent about the risks that they are taking, as opposed to trying to sweep them under the rug and to say, fund this initiative with your eyes closed because it's very safe.
I think that's a brilliant antidote to the sort of loser terminology. Someone screwed up, they've made a mistake, let's shoot them. That is so prevalent.
And by the way, there are side effects to this mentality which are terrible. One side effect that rarely gets discussed is that if you are a smart executive in a big corporation, where you want to be is in a place where you are going to be successful, not because you're great, but because everybody is going to be successful. I used to work a lot in consumer goods when I was a consultant. And there was a very clear path to the top of any consumer goods company. It was to get assigned to China. Because 10 or 15 years ago, the Chinese market was growing 30% a year in every category, and you were going to be a hero. I mean, unless you did something monumentally wrong, you were basically going to come back with the aura of someone who had grown the business 30% a year, while your colleagues in the UK and Germany and France and Italy were sweating and toiling to grow 2 or 3% a year. And you don't want your best people to spend their energy jostling to get the right assignment because you'd much prefer them to be jostling to beat your competitors. So this is one of the side effects of this mentality of let's judge people by their results. It kills risk-taking, or it kills the right sort of risk-taking. It gets people to focus on picking their battlefield rather than fighting the battle, and there are many other problems with it.
Fascinating stuff. Before I let you go, I just quickly want to touch on Noise, which is your next big project and has some very big names from the world of behavioral science associated, Daniel Kahneman being one of them. Can you just tell us briefly what that's about and when we can expect to see this long-awaited book?
So you can expect to read this long-awaited book in May 2021. It's called Noise. It's a project by Daniel Kahneman, Cass Sunstein, and myself. And the topic is judgment, and professional judgment in particular, and the fact that wherever there is professional judgment, there is noise, there is variability. We talk a lot, and we've talked a lot this past hour, about biases, cognitive biases that lead us to make predictable mistakes. So, for instance, we know that if you and I and 20 other people have to make an estimate of the time it will take to complete a particular project, there will be an optimistic bias in that plan. This is the planning fallacy. We know we will be over-optimistic on average. But there is something that rarely gets discussed, which is that between the probably optimistic estimate that you make and the probably optimistic estimate that I make and the probably optimistic estimate that someone else makes, there is random variation. There is noise. And this noise rarely gets discussed. It is actually the cause of many judgment errors. It is the cause of much lost money. It is the cause, interestingly, of much unfairness, because there is noise, for instance, in judicial decisions and medical decisions. Without any particular motive or bias, people will diverge in largely unpredictable ways in the judgments they make and the decisions they make. And that is a cause of much error that we should do something about. That's the topic of noise.
Fantastic. Well, look, we've now got a date, which is fantastic, which I wasn't aware of. So that's great stuff. Olivier, thank you so much. One, for an absolutely stimulating conversation that I could willingly continue for hours, but we don't have that time, and nor I'm sure do my listeners want to listen to me. I think they'd rather spend their time reading your book. So we'll put links to that in the show notes, together with some of the other videos and interviews that you've done. But thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book in French, and I've thoroughly enjoyed reading it again in English with some of the changes that you've made there. So thank you so much for taking the time and for all the things that you've shared with us.
Thank you very much, Christian. It was a pleasure.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My massive thanks to Olivier for appearing and to you for listening. If you're interested in finding out more about Olivier's book, You're About to Make a Terrible Mistake, there's a link to that in the show notes and links to his videos as well, where he explores some of the ideas that he covers in the book. Well worth taking a look at it. If you're new to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. Any listeners who felt able to leave a 5-star review for the show, that would be much appreciated. Really helps raise the profile, meaning I can continue to attract high quality guests and other people can find the show. I'll be back very soon with another episode, but in the meantime, thank you so much for listening. Stay safe, and I'll see you very soon on this channel.